Olivia came back from her walk this afternoon, and right away, something felt off. She didn't look like herself. Her steps were stiff, her movements deliberate, almost awkward. And her expression, well, it wasn't the relaxed smile of someone who'd just enjoyed a peaceful walk. "How was it?" I asked, glancing up from my phone as she stepped into the house. "Nice," she said a little too quickly. Her voice was bright, but her eyes didn't meet mine. I noticed it then, a small, dark, wet spot on the back of her dress. It wasn't huge, but it stood out. It hadn't rained, and the ground outside was dry. So what could it be? I didn't say anything right away, just kept my face neutral as she breezed past me and into the kitchen. She grabbed a glass of water, her back to me. There was something mechanical about the way she moved, like she was hyper-aware of herself. It was subtle, but I've known Olivia for years. This wasn't normal. "I'm going to take a shower," she announced suddenly, not looking at me. Before I could respond, she disappeared down the hallway. Now, I'm not a paranoid guy by nature. I don't snoop. I don't jump to conclusions. But something about the way she was acting just didn't sit right with me. So I did something I'd never done before. I followed her. The bathroom door didn't close all the way. It never really latched properly, and she didn't seem to notice. From where I stood, I could see her reflection in the mirror as she undressed. And that's when it hit me, like a ton of bricks. She wasn't wearing any underwear. I froze. Olivia never went out without underwear. She's particular about things like that, always making sure she's put together. And yet, here she was, undressing after her walk, her dress slipping off to reveal nothing underneath. The pieces started falling into place in my head. The odd way she'd walked in, stiff and awkward. The wet spot on her dress. Her sudden need to take a shower. What the hell had happened while she was out? My stomach twisted into knots as I stood there, unable to move. I felt like I was watching a movie in slow motion, except it was my life. My wife, my marriage. And something was very, very wrong. The sound of the shower turning on snapped me out of it. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Questions raced through my mind. Why wasn't she wearing underwear? Was there an innocent explanation for all of this, or was my gut right? Was there something she wasn't telling me? I didn't say anything to her that night. I couldn't. I needed more proof, more answers, more something. But deep down, I already knew. This wasn't nothing. This was the beginning of something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The next morning, Olivia was up earlier than usual. Normally, she'd linger in bed, scrolling through her phone or chatting with me while sipping her first cup of coffee. But today she was already dressed and heading out the door before I'd even finished brushing my teeth. "Early meeting?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I leaned against the doorway. "Yeah," she replied, her tone clipped. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer her usual playful commentary about her coworkers, just grabbed her bag and kissed me on the cheek. "I'll see you later." And then she was gone. It wasn't just the early departure that caught my attention. It was the bag. Olivia always carried the same leather tote to work, a practical thing with room for her laptop, files, and anything else she might need. But today she'd swapped it for a smaller, more stylish purse, something she usually reserved for evenings out, not office meetings. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, a strange unease settling over me. I told myself it was nothing. People change up their routines all the time, right? Maybe she just felt like dressing up a little. But that explanation didn't sit well with me. It felt too easy, too convenient. Later that morning, I walked into the bedroom to grab my phone charger. Her desk caught my eye. Olivia's always been organized to a fault. Everything in its place, no clutter. But her work documents were still sitting there, untouched. The file she'd been working on all week, the one she'd said she absolutely had to bring to this morning's meeting, was right there on the desk. "That doesn't make sense," I muttered to myself. If she had a meeting, why would she leave behind the one thing she'd need for it? I tried to brush it off, but my mind wouldn't let it go. As the day went on, more little things began to nag at me. Her phone, for example. It had been sitting on the kitchen counter when she left, face down as usual. I'd never thought much about that before. Lots of people put their phones screen down. But now, it felt like a deliberate move, as if she didn't want me to see her notifications. The day dragged on. each minute amplifying the tension in my chest. By the time Olivia came home, I'd worked myself into a state of quiet anxiety. She walked through the door with her usual smile, but something about it felt off. It didn't reach her eyes. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to sound as normal as possible. "Busy," she said, kicking off her shoes. That meeting went way longer than I expected. She didn't offer any details, didn't complain about how exhausting it had been, or mention anything funny her coworkers had said. Just busy, and nothing more. I nodded, pretending to accept it, but inside my thoughts were racing. If the meeting had run long, why were her work documents still on the desk? And why hadn't she called or texted me all day like she usually did? I spent the rest of the evening in a haze, my mind circling the same questions over and over. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she was just tired or stressed or going through some kind of personal phase she hadn't talked about yet. But then I'd think about the bag, the forgotten documents, the phone turned face down, and the doubts would creep back in. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess. Was I being paranoid? Was I creating problems where there weren't any? Or was this the start of something I didn't want to face? Her soft laughter broke the silence. It was faint, coming from the living room where she was scrolling through her phone. Normally, I'd find the sound comforting, but tonight, it sent a chill down my spine. Who was she texting? What was so funny? And why did it feel like I was the only one not in on the joke? I turned over, my chest tight with unease. This wasn't like me. I wasn't the type to doubt her, to read into every little thing. But something had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into something I wasn't ready to see. "I have to know," I whispered to myself. Whatever this was, whatever was happening, I couldn't keep ignoring it. It was time to start paying attention, really paying attention. Because if my gut was right, this was just the beginning. It happened late one evening when Olivia had gone to bed early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. I stayed up pretending to watch TV, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying all the little oddities I'd noticed over the past few days. I felt like I was living in a shadow, surrounded by questions without answers. And then an opportunity presented itself. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter. Normally, she kept it close to her, even when she wasn't using it. But tonight, she'd left it unattended. My eyes kept darting toward it as I sat on the couch, my heart pounding. Was this my chance to finally get some clarity? I tried to talk myself out of it. Snooping wasn't something I'd ever done, and the thought of invading her privacy made my stomach churn. But then I remembered the way she'd been acting. The early mornings, the sudden changes, the bag, the forgotten documents. Every instinct in me screamed that something wasn't right. Before I could stop myself, I was standing in front of the counter, staring down at her phone. The screen lit up as I picked it up, and that's when I saw it. A notification from a contact named Rachel. Except the message didn't sound like something one woman would send to another. "Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was amazing." My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might throw up. My hand trembled as I scrolled up, desperate to see the rest of the conversation. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. Messages about secret meetups, compliments that made my stomach turn, and vivid descriptions of moments that didn't belong in our marriage. "You're all I can think about," one message read. "I can't wait to see you again." I put the phone down, my mind reeling. The room seemed to tilt around me as I tried to process what I'd just seen. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me suspended in a void of disbelief and betrayal. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the phone as if it might somehow explain itself. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But deep down, I knew there was no misinterpreting what I'd just read. My thoughts spiraled as I tried to make sense of it all. How long had this been going on? Who was this person? And why? What had I done, or failed to do, to make her seek something outside of our marriage? I felt a wave of anger rise in me, hot and suffocating. How could she do this? After everything we'd been through together, after all the trust we'd built, how could she betray me like this? But underneath the anger was something else. Fear of what this meant for us, for our future, fear of confronting her and hearing the truth I wasn't sure I was ready for, and fear of what I might do next. I needed to talk to someone. Keeping all of this bottled up was tearing me apart. I couldn't make sense of it on my own, and I needed an outside perspective before I did something rash. Jacob, my best friend since college. He was the one person I could always count on to be honest with me, even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. If anyone could help me figure out what to do, it was him. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over his name. For a moment I hesitated. What would I even say? How could I put into words the mess my life had suddenly become? But then I thought about the messages on Olivia's phone, the lies, the betrayal. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I hit the call button and listened to the line ring, my heart pounding in my chest. When Jacob's voice came through, calm and familiar, I felt a small measure of relief. "Hey, John, what's up?" I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I spoke. "Jacob, I need to talk to you. It's about Olivia. Something's not right." For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. Whatever came next, I knew I'd need support to get through it, and this was the first step. The next morning, I drove over to Jacob's house. He lived on the edge of town, a quiet place with a wraparound porch and a couple of rocking chairs that always seemed to invite conversation. Jacob had been my best friend since college, the kind of guy who would listen without judgment but wouldn't hesitate to tell me the hard truths. When I arrived, he was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, flipping through a newspaper. He looked up as I parked the car, his face breaking into a grin. "John, what brings you here so early?" he asked, setting the paper aside. I climbed the steps and sank into the chair next to him. For a moment, I just stared out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My chest felt tight, and I didn't know how to start. Jacob didn't press me, just waited, sipping his coffee. Finally, I took a deep breath. "Jacob, I think something's going on with Olivia." His brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, setting his mug down. "What do you mean?" I told him everything. The messages, the changes in her behavior, the phone face down on the counter, the forgotten work documents. As I spoke, the words came faster, spilling out like a dam breaking. Jacob didn't interrupt, just nodded occasionally, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. That's a lot, John. Have you confronted her about any of this?" I shook my head. "Number, I don't even know where to start. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm blowing this out of proportion?" Jacob tilted his head, considering. "From what you've told me, it doesn't sound like you're imagining things. But you're right, not to jump to conclusions without proof. If this is what you think it is, you need to know for sure before you confront her." His words hit me hard. Proof. That was the missing piece. Without it, I had nothing but suspicions, and that wasn't enough to go on. "So what do I do?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Jacob leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "There are a few things you could try. Start simple. Pay attention to her schedule, her habits. If something doesn't add up, dig a little deeper, and—" He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's tech for this kind of thing, if you're comfortable with it. GPS trackers, hidden cameras, phone monitoring apps. I'm not saying you need to go full spy, but tools like that can help you get the clarity you need." The idea of spying on Olivia made my stomach churn, but I couldn't deny the logic behind it. If she was hiding something, I needed to know. "I'll think about it," I said. Jacob nodded. "Whatever you decide, just remember you're not alone in this. If you need help, you call me, all right?" For the first time in days, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Just saying everything out loud, having someone listen and validate my feelings, made the situation feel a little less overwhelming. "Thanks, Jacob," I said, standing up. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," he replied with a small smile. "But I'm glad you came by. Keep me posted, all right?" As I drove home, my mind was spinning with everything we'd talked about. I didn't have a clear plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore this anymore. If Olivia was lying to me, I needed to know, and if she wasn't, well, I'd need to find a way to rebuild the trust that was slipping through my fingers. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd made up my mind. I'd start small, watching her habits, looking for inconsistencies. And if that didn't give me the answers I needed, I'd consider taking Jacob's advice about the tech. Whatever it took, I was ready to uncover the truth. After my conversation with Jacob, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. The house was quiet. Olivia had gone to bed early again, citing a headache, and the silence felt oppressive. I stared at the blank page for a moment, then wrote at the top, "Find the truth." I started listing everything I needed to do. First, I needed to decide on the best way to gather evidence. Jacob's suggestions had given me a lot to think about. Trackers, hidden cameras, phone monitoring apps. Each option had its pros and cons, and I couldn't afford to get this wrong. My gut told me to start small and build from there. With that in mind, I opened my laptop and began searching online. Forums dedicated to infidelity and private investigations were a goldmine of information. People shared their stories, their mistakes, and their successes, and I absorbed it all like a sponge. One thread caught my eye: how to use a GPS tracker without getting caught. The poster had detailed instructions on how to install a tracker discreetly and interpret the data it provided. I clicked through link after link, eventually landing on a review site for various GPS devices. One model stood out: small, easy to use, and designed to be hidden in a car. It wasn't cheap, but it seemed reliable. I added it to my cart and hesitated for a moment before hitting Buy Now. My hands were shaking as I completed the purchase. This was it, the first step toward uncovering the truth. As I waited for the confirmation email, I turned my attention to another tool: a phone monitoring app. On a different forum, I found recommendations for software that could track messages, calls, and even location. It felt invasive, almost too far, but the thought of being in the dark was worse. I downloaded a trial version onto my own phone to test its functionality, feeling a mix of guilt and determination. Halfway through setting it up, my phone buzzed. It was Jacob. "Hey," he said when I answered. "I was thinking about our talk earlier. You sure you're okay with all this? I mean, it's a slippery slope." "I don't know if I'm okay with it," I admitted. "But I can't just sit here and do nothing. I have to know." Jacob sighed. "All right. Just be careful. And remember, whatever you find, you can handle it. You're stronger than you think." After we hung up, I sat in the darkened kitchen, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The confirmation email for the GPS tracker had arrived. Delivery was scheduled for 2 days from now. 2 days until I could start piecing together the puzzle. I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over me. Every part of this felt wrong, like I was betraying Olivia even as I tried to uncover her betrayal. But the alternative, living in ignorance, was unbearable. By the time I crawled into bed, I'd made up my mind. I would install the tracker the moment it arrived and monitor her movements carefully. If there was something to find, this would be the way to find it. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in days, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't foolproof, but it was something, and that was enough to keep me going. 2 days, just 2 more days. The GPS tracker arrived 2 days later, just as the delivery confirmation email had promised. I opened the package in the garage, away from Olivia's eyes, and examined the small device. It was compact, easy to hide, and paired seamlessly with an app on my phone. The instructions were straightforward, but as I held it in my hands, I couldn't ignore the weight of what I was about to do. That evening, Olivia announced she was going to meet a friend for dinner. It was perfect timing. Once she left, I took the tracker and headed to her car in the driveway. The night was quiet, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. I felt exposed, like every movement was being watched, even though I knew no one was there. I crouched by her car and carefully attached the tracker under the driver's seat. My heart was racing, and my hands shook as I double-checked the placement. It was out of sight, but secure. After a final glance to ensure everything looked normal, I stood up and wiped my hands on my jeans. Back inside, I opened the app on my phone and watched as the tracker came to life, displaying its location in real time. A small dot on the map represented her car, sitting right where I'd left it. It was surreal. I felt like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but the thought of not knowing the truth was worse. When Olivia returned later that night, she seemed her usual self. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and chatted about her evening. I nodded along, pretending everything was fine, but my mind was elsewhere. As soon as she went to bed, I checked the app. Her car's movements were mapped out. A short drive to the restaurant she'd mentioned, then back home. Nothing suspicious, not yet. The next few days were uneventful. I monitored the tracker obsessively, noting every stop she made. Work, grocery store, home. Her routine seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a facade. I reminded myself that patience was key. If something was happening, it wouldn't necessarily reveal itself immediately. In addition to the tracker, I'd set up a small camera in the living room. It was hidden among the books on the shelf, angled to capture the entire room. I checked the footage each night, looking for anything out of place. So far, there was nothing unusual, just Olivia watching TV, scrolling on her phone, or reading. Yet every time I pressed play, my heart pounded with anticipation, expecting something. The emotional toll was starting to weigh on me. The constant surveillance, the secrecy, the waiting, it was exhausting. Part of me wanted to abandon the whole thing, to confront her outright, and demand the truth. But another part, the part that kept me up at night, insisted I stay the course. I needed proof. Without it, I had nothing but suspicions. One evening, as I reviewed the tracker data, I noticed a slight deviation. She'd taken a different route home from work, stopping briefly at a location I didn't recognize. It was a small parking lot near a park. The stop lasted less than 10 minutes before she continued home. My stomach twisted as I stared at the map. It could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. I decided to give it a few more days. If the pattern repeated, I'd know it wasn't a coincidence. Until then, all I could do was wait and watch. The tension was unbearable. Every notification from the app, every movement on the map, sent my heart racing. I felt like a predator stalking prey, constantly on edge, waiting for the moment to strike. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, one I didn't recognize in myself. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I told myself this was just the beginning. The tracker was in place, the camera was recording, and the truth would reveal itself in time. All I had to do was hold on a little longer. The routine surveillance had become second nature. Each day I checked the GPS logs, scanned through the camera footage, and jotted down every little detail in my notebook. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Olivia's days followed the same pattern: work, errands, home. But as the week progressed, a subtle change caught my attention. The GPS tracker showed a consistent detour. 3 times that week, Olivia had driven to a small neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't on her way home or near any of her usual stops. Each visit lasted less than half an hour before she continued on. My chest tightened every time I saw the dot on the map linger there. What was she doing? On Thursday evening, as I reviewed the data, I noticed something else. She'd come home slightly later than usual. Her explanation was simple: traffic. But when I checked the tracker, it told a different story. Her car had been stationary for 20 minutes in that same neighborhood. That's when the doubts began to solidify into something heavier, something I couldn't ignore. I turned to the camera footage from the living room. It showed her coming home, setting her bag on the counter, and pulling out her phone. She scrolled for a moment, her face unreadable, then quickly deleted several messages. My stomach twisted. Olivia wasn't the type to delete messages. She usually left everything on her phone, even the spam. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to check her phone while she was in the shower. It was risky, and my hand shook as I unlocked the screen using the passcode I'd memorized months ago. Her message history seemed normal, but then I opened her archived chats. That's where I found it, a thread with someone named Eli. The messages weren't explicit, but they were far too familiar for my comfort. Can't wait to see you again. Last time was amazing. You make me feel alive. My head spun as I scrolled through the conversation, each word feeling like a nail in the coffin of my marriage. When I heard the water shut off, I quickly put her phone back and retreated to the kitchen, my heart pounding. I couldn't stop replaying the messages in my head. Was this the confirmation I'd been dreading, or was there still some way to explain it away? That evening, Olivia seemed cheerful, even affectionate. She laughed at my jokes, kissed me on the cheek, and asked about my day. It felt like a mockery. I couldn't help but analyze every move she made, every word she said, searching for cracks in her facade. But if there were any, she hid them well. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a storm of emotions brewing inside me. Anger, betrayal, sadness, they all fought for dominance. But above all, there was determination. I needed more. More proof, more answers. This wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, as I reviewed the GPS logs again, I made a decision. If she went back to that neighborhood, I would follow her. I couldn't rely solely on the tracker or the camera anymore. I needed to see it with my own eyes. That evening, as Olivia got ready to leave, she mentioned she had to run an errand. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "Sure," I said, pretending to be engrossed in the book I wasn't actually reading. The moment she left, I grabbed my keys and followed at a safe distance. The Jeep showed her heading toward the same neighborhood. My palms were slick with sweat as I drove, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. When she pulled into a small parking lot near a park, I parked a block away and watched as she stepped out of the car. What I saw next made my breath catch in my throat. She wasn't alone. The moment I saw her step out of the car, my chest tightened. Olivia looked around as if checking to see if anyone was watching before walking toward the park. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then he appeared. A man, tall and casually dressed, with a confident stride. They greeted each other with a hug that lasted a second too long. My stomach churned as I watched them walk deeper into the park together. I waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. They finally emerged, laughing, their hands brushing against each other's. When Olivia kissed him on the cheek and got back into her car, I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an innocent meeting. This was betrayal, plain and simple. I followed her home, keeping a safe distance. My mind was racing, a storm of emotions that I could barely contain. Anger, pain, humiliation, they all blended together into a blinding rage. By the time I parked in the driveway, I was trembling. She walked into the house, smiling as if nothing had happened. I stayed in the car, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't the time to confront her. Not yet. Later that night, when she was asleep, I reviewed the footage from the hidden camera in the living room. There it was, clear as day. Olivia, sitting on the couch, laughing as she spoke to the same man on a video call. "I can't wait to see you again," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Me too," she replied, her voice soft in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Last night was amazing." My jaw clenched as I watched her giggle like a teenager. They discussed plans for their next meeting, reminiscing about their time together in the park. Every word felt like a dagger to the heart. The man's name was Eli, and from the way they spoke, this wasn't a new affair. This had been going on for weeks, maybe months. I paused the video and stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the dark monitor. How had I missed this? How had I let it get this far? The woman I'd loved, trusted, and built a life with was living a double life, and I had been blind to it, but not anymore. The pain gave way to anger, a cold and calculated fury that cleared my thoughts. This wasn't just about Olivia's betrayal. This was about Eli, too. They'd both made a mockery of my marriage, my trust, and my dignity, and they were going to pay for it. I grabbed a notebook and started writing. Each page filled with details about their affair, plans for their meetings, and the evidence I'd gathered. But this wasn't just a record. It was the foundation of my revenge. First, I researched Eli. His social media accounts were easy to find. He was a mid-level executive at a local company, married with 2 kids. His wife frequently posted pictures of their family vacations, their kids' school events, their happy life. The irony made me sick. Soon, his perfect little world would come crashing down. Next, I thought about Olivia. She'd built a reputation among her friends and colleagues as dependable, loyal, and professional. They saw her as someone to admire, but soon they'd see her for what she really was. I started drafting a plan. First, I'd gather more evidence, enough to ensure neither of them could deny what they'd done. Then I'd release it strategically. Eli's wife would get the video calls and text messages. His employer would get the footage of him skipping work to meet Olivia. As for Olivia, her friends and family would know the truth. Every carefully curated lie she'd built would unravel in front of her eyes. By the time I closed the notebook, my hands were steady and my mind was clear. They thought they could get away with this, that their little secret would stay hidden, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. As I sat back and looked at the pages in front of me, a bitter smile crossed my face. They had no idea what was coming, but soon they would. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Every spare moment was spent refining my plan, ensuring every detail was perfect. My notebook became a blueprint of destruction, each page filled with names, dates, and connections. Olivia and Eli, they wouldn't see it coming. I started with Olivia's digital footprint. Her social media accounts were carefully curated, projecting an image of perfection. It didn't take much to find inconsistencies, though. Through an anonymous account, I reached out to a few of her colleagues, subtly dropping hints about her behavior. Have you noticed Olivia leaving early lately? Or, isn't it strange how she's been acting? Planting seeds of doubt was the first step. Next, I turned to Eli. His professional life seemed stable on the surface, but a deeper dive revealed cracks. A few anonymous tips sent to his HR department, complete with video evidence of his meetings with Olivia, were enough to set things in motion. I crafted an email, attaching snippets of their video calls and photos of their encounters. The subject line read, "Urgent, potential conduct violation." With both targets identified, I began compiling evidence for Eli's wife. I had enough to paint a vivid picture, screenshots of messages, videos of their meetups, and even the GPS logs showing repeated trips to the same location. I knew the impact this would have on her and their family, but I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty. They'd made their choices. The most challenging part was setting up the distribution network. I created burner email accounts, encrypted folders, and a secure cloud storage link for each recipient. It was critical that no one could trace this back to me. Each piece of evidence was labeled and time-stamped, making it impossible for them to deny. By the time everything was in place, I felt like a shadow of myself. The rage that had driven me was now tempered by a cold, calculated resolve. Every step of the plan was another nail in the coffin of their betrayal. Still, a small part of me wondered if I'd gone too far. But every time that doubt crept in, I replayed the videos and messages. Their laughter, their intimacy. It reignited the fire in me. The final stage of preparation was timing. I coordinated everything to hit at once, ensuring maximum impact. The emails would go out simultaneously, leaving Olivia and Eli scrambling to contain the fallout. The first wave would expose their affair to their respective circles, while the second would deliver the evidence to their employers and families. As the day approached, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Sitting at my desk, I stared at the computer screen, my finger hovering over the send button. It all came down to this moment. Years of trust and love shattered by their betrayal, now culminating in this act of revenge. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back now. I clicked send, and the emails went out like missiles, each one carrying a payload of truth and destruction. As I leaned back in my chair, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control. The wheels were in motion, and their perfect little worlds were about to come crashing down. Now, all I had to do was wait. The fallout was swift and brutal. Once the emails were sent, there was no stopping the chain reaction. Olivia's phone started buzzing incessantly. Her friends, family, and colleagues had all received the videos, messages, and pictures. Within hours, the perfect image she'd cultivated over the years was shattered. Her boss, upon reviewing the evidence, called her into his office the next morning. By the afternoon, she was escorted out of the building with her belongings in a cardboard box. The scandal spread through her professional network like wildfire, and no one wanted to associate with someone whose personal life was now a public circus. Her personal relationships didn't fare any better. Friends who once adored her turned their backs, disgusted by her deceit. At a family dinner that weekend, her parents, stoic and unforgiving, asked her to leave their house and not return until she made things right. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. For the first time in years, Olivia was utterly alone. Eli's descent was even more catastrophic. His wife received everything: the videos, the messages, the GPS logs. She confronted him in their home, throwing his belongings onto the front lawn as their children watched from the windows, confused and crying. Within days, she filed for divorce, requesting full custody of their kids and a restraining order against him. But Eli's troubles didn't stop there. The evidence sent to his employer painted a damning picture of his conduct. An internal investigation was launched, and he was promptly terminated for breaching company policies. His professional reputation, once solid and respected, was now in ruins. To make matters worse, the videos began circulating online, shared across social media and forums. His name became synonymous with scandal, and even strangers mocked him in comment sections. By the end of the week, Olivia and Eli had both lost everything. She moved into a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize her. Eli retreated to his brother's basement, a shadow of the confident man he once was. They'd thought their secret would remain safe, but now it was a matter of public humiliation and shame. As for me, I watched it all unfold from a distance. I'd expected to feel a surge of satisfaction, maybe even triumph, but instead, there was a quiet stillness. The anger that had consumed me for weeks had burned itself out, leaving behind a strange sense of relief. I'd won. There was no denying that. They'd paid the price for their betrayal, and justice had been served. But as I sat alone in my now empty house, I realized that vengeance didn't fill the void they'd left behind. It only made space for something new. I reflected on the cost of it all, the time, the energy, the emotional toll. Was it worth it? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing was certain: I'd reclaimed control over my life. I was no longer the naive husband living in blissful ignorance. I was free. Closing my notebook, now filled with every detail of my plan, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. This chapter of my life was over. Olivia and Eli had gotten what they deserved, and now it was time for me to move forward. Justice had been served, and with that, I turned the page, ready to start anew.